The boy left an apple on a park bench every day for a homeless old man, but one day he saw a man with bodyguards on the bench. In a world where a single apple on a park bench sparks unforeseen connections, witness a tale of chance encounters and unexpected friendships. When Liam's simple act of kindness leads to a bond with the enigmatic Daniel, secrets and revelations unravel, transforming lives. Dive into a heartwarming journey where small gestures ignite profound changes, and every meeting could be the start of something extraordinary. Get ready for a story where kindness weaves a web of adventure and hope. Don't miss the magic. I've always felt like an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit in with the other kids. While they spent their afternoons racing around the playground, I was more likely to be found in the quiet corners of the school library. There, surrounded by shelves of dusty books, I felt at home. The characters in those pages were my friends, their stories my adventures. They never teased me for being quiet or shy. They accepted me just as I was. At home, things weren't much different. My parents were good people, but they were always busy. Dad with his long hours at the office and Mom with her never-ending list of tasks. They loved me, I knew that, but they never seemed to have time for me. "Liam, can you set the table for dinner?" Mom would call out from the kitchen, her voice strained with the weight of too many things to do. "Sure, Mom," I'd reply, putting down my book reluctantly. I was used to being alone, even when I wasn't physically by myself. After dinner, I'd retreat to my room with a book in hand. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the loneliness that seemed to follow me everywhere. In the pages of my favorite books, I found friends who never let me down, heroes who faced challenges and won, kids like me who found a way to belong. One of my favorite books was about a boy who found a magical garden. Every time I read it, I could almost feel the soft grass beneath my feet, smell the fragrant flowers, and hear the rustle of the leaves in the wind. I would lose myself in those stories, wishing that I could find a magical place of my own, somewhere I belonged. One evening, after another lonely day at school, I found myself standing in front of the old oak tree in the park, my book tucked under my arm. The tree was my favorite spot in the park, a massive ancient thing with thick roots that curled up from the ground like giant snakes. Its branches stretched out wide, providing a perfect canopy of shade. As I settled down at the base of the tree, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Across the park, on a weathered bench near the path, sat an old man and his dog. I had seen them there before, always in the same spot, always together. The man had a weathered face, his skin tanned and wrinkled like the pages of an old book. The dog, a scruffy-looking mutt, was curled up at his feet, its eyes half closed in contentment. I watched them for a moment, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite name. The old man and his dog seemed so at peace, so connected. I wished I could talk to them, to maybe even sit with them on the bench. But the thought of approaching them made my heart race with anxiety. What if the old man didn't want to talk? What if he thought I was bothering him? As I sat there, I felt my usual loneliness creeping back in. I opened my book, trying to lose myself in the story, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting back to the old man and his dog, and the quiet bond they seemed to share. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about them. I imagined what it would be like to have a friend like that, someone who was always there, who understood me without needing words. The next day at school, as I sat alone in the cafeteria, I overheard a couple of boys talking about their weekend plans. They were going to the movies together, and the excitement in their voices was palpable. I watched them from across the room, feeling the familiar ache of wanting to belong, of wanting to be included. Later that afternoon, as I walked home from school, I passed by a small grocery store. In the window was a display of bright, shiny apples, their red skins gleaming in the sunlight. On a whim, I went inside and bought one with the few coins I had in my pocket. When I got home, I stared at the apple for a long time, turning it over in my hands. It was just an apple, but for some reason, it made me think of the old man and his dog. I wondered if they had enough to eat, if anyone ever thought to help them. The thought stayed with me. And the next day, as I walked to the park with my book in hand, I slipped the apple into my bag. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but something inside me told me to take it with me. When I reached the park, I saw the old man and his dog sitting on their usual bench. My heart started to pound, but I didn't let myself think too much about it. Instead, I walked over to the bench and, without saying a word, placed the apple on the seat beside him. The old man looked up at me in surprise, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice soft and kind. I felt my face flush, and I quickly nodded before turning to leave. As I walked away, I heard him say something to his dog, and I glanced back just in time to see the dog wagging its tail happily. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop smiling. It was a small thing, just an apple, but it made me feel like I had done something good, something that mattered. For once, I didn't feel so alone. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the old man and his dog, and I realized something. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as lonely a place as I had always thought. And maybe, by reaching out, even in small ways, I could find the connection I had been longing for. The next day, as I walked to the park, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path as I made my way to the old oak tree. I had my book with me, but today it felt different. There was a nervous energy in my chest, a feeling I hadn't quite shaken off since yesterday. In my hand, I held another apple, red, shiny, and perfect. I had picked it out carefully from the basket at the grocery store, just like I had the day before. It felt important, like I was carrying something more than just a piece of fruit. It was a small act, but it meant something, at least to me. As I approached the park bench, I saw the old man and his dog in their usual spot. The man was hunched over slightly, his woolen cap pulled low over his brow to shield his eyes from the morning sun. The dog, as always, was curled up at his feet, a loyal companion that seemed to sense his every mood. I hesitated for a moment, the apple growing heavy in my hand. What if yesterday had been enough? What if he didn't need or want another apple? But the thought of turning back felt wrong, like I'd be retreating into the lonely shell I'd worked so hard to step out of. So, taking a deep breath, I walked over to the bench. This time, the old man looked up before I had a chance to set the apple down. His eyes were a faded blue, like the sky on a winter's day, and they crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Back again, I see," he said, his voice warm and gravelly, like he'd spent a lifetime speaking in whispers. I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, the nervousness melting away. "Yeah," I replied softly, holding out the apple. He took it from my hand with a nod of thanks. "You're a kind lad," he said, his hand brushing mine briefly. "Not many folks these days would bother with an old man like me." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, feeling a little shy under his steady gaze. The dog, noticing the apple, perked up and wagged its tail, a slow, lazy rhythm that seemed to match the old man's movements. "What's your name, son?" the old man asked as he offered a piece of the apple to the dog, who took it gently from his hand. "Liam," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And yours?" "Name's Tom," he replied, taking a small bite of the apple himself. "And this here is Max," he added, gesturing to the dog, who looked up at me with soft brown eyes. "Hi, Max," I said, smiling at the dog. I reached out tentatively, and Max sniffed my hand before giving it a friendly lick. Tom chuckled, a sound that was rough but not unkind. "He likes you," he said. "Doesn't take to just anyone, you know." I felt a small surge of pride at that, and I couldn't help but smile. "He's a good dog," I said, glancing from Max to Tom. "You must be good to him." Tom's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes growing distant as he looked down at Max. "We take care of each other," he said quietly. "He's all I've got, and I'm all he has. We make do." There was a sadness in his voice that tugged at something deep inside me. I knew what it was like to feel alone, to cling to the small things that brought comfort, like a favorite book or a familiar routine. And I imagined that for Tom, Max was that comfort, that constant presence that made the loneliness a little easier to bear. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of the apple as Tom and Max shared it between them. I didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with words. Just being there, sitting on the bench with Tom and Max, felt like enough. After a while, Tom spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. "You're a good boy, Liam," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Not many people take the time to see what's right in front of them. But you did. You saw me, and you saw Max. That means something." I looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. I just thought you might like an apple," I said, feeling suddenly small in the presence of his wisdom. Tom turned to me, his eyes clear and kind. "It's not about the apple, son. It's about the thought, the kindness. That's what makes the difference." I nodded, understanding what he meant, even if I couldn't put it into words. It wasn't just the apple. It was the act of reaching out, of making the connection, however small. It was something I had been searching for in my own life, without even realizing it. As I stood up to leave, Tom reached out and patted my arm. "Thank you, Liam," he said softly. "You've got a good heart. Don't ever lose that." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As I walked away, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted. The park, with its golden leaves and bright sunlight, seemed warmer, more welcoming, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. As the days turned into weeks, my visits to the park became more than just a routine. They became a ritual. Each afternoon after school, I would stop by the small grocery store on the corner, carefully selecting the best apple I could find. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, began to recognize me and would sometimes even save a particularly nice apple for me, knowing my preference. "Another apple for your friend today," she would ask with a gentle smile as she handed me my change. "Yeah," I'd reply, smiling back. "He really likes them. And the dog, too, I bet." She'd chuckle, watching as I carefully placed the apple in my backpack. This small exchange, though brief, had become a part of the ritual, and it filled me with a quiet sense of purpose. I wasn't just going to the park to read anymore. I was going to check on Tom and Max, to make sure they had something to eat, and to share a moment with them. It was something I looked forward to every day. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I approached the park bench, I saw Tom sitting in his usual spot, his woolen cap pulled low, and Max lying at his feet. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest now, blanketing the ground in shades of orange and gold. The air was cool, but not cold, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in dappled patches. "Afternoon, Liam," Tom greeted me as I neared the bench, his voice as familiar to me now as the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. "Hi, Tom." "Hi, Max," I said, kneeling down to pet Max, who thumped his tail lazily against the ground in response. I pulled the apple out of my backpack and handed it to Tom, who took it with a smile. "Ah, you've got a good eye for these," Tom remarked, turning the apple over in his hands. "This one's a beauty." "I try to pick the best ones," I replied, settling onto the bench beside him. Tom nodded appreciatively. "You've got a knack for it," he said, cutting a small piece off the apple with his pocket knife and handing it to Max, who accepted it with a gentle nibble. We sat in companionable silence for a few moments. The sounds of the park, birds chirping, leaves rustling, distant laughter, filling the space between us. I glanced at Tom, noticing the way his hands, rough and calloused, moved with careful precision as he sliced the apple. "You're always so careful with the apple," I observed, curiosity getting the better of me. Tom chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "When you don't have much, you learn to appreciate the little things," he explained. "An apple like this, Ripe, sweet. It's a gift. No sense in rushing through it. I nodded, thinking about his words. It made sense, in a way I hadn't considered before. The small things, like the apple or the time we spent together, held more value when they weren't taken for granted. Do you ever get tired of apples? I asked, half joking but genuinely curious. Tom laughed, a warm, hearty sound that made me smile. Not when they're given with kindness, he said, shaking his head. Besides, Max here would have my head if I ever refused. Max looked up at the sound of his name, his ears perking up slightly, as if understanding the conversation. I couldn't help but laugh at the way the dog seemed so attuned to Tom, like they shared some unspoken bond that went beyond words. As Tom handed Max another piece of the apple, I found myself thinking about that bond. It was something I admired, the way they took care of each other, shared what little they had, and found comfort in each other's company. It was the kind of friendship I had only read about in books, and yet here it was, right in front of me. Tom, I began hesitantly, unsure if I should ask the question that had been on my mind for a while. How did you and Max meet? Tom paused, the apple half-eaten in his hand, and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. That's a story, all right, he said, leaning back against the bench. You sure you want to hear it? I nodded eagerly, sensing that this was more than just a simple tale. Well, it was a few years back, Tom started, his voice taking on a reflective tone. I wasn't doing so well, you know. Lost my job, lost my home. Things were rough. I found myself a spot down by the river, under one of those old bridges. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, at least. He paused, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. One night, I heard this whining, a pitiful sound, coming from the other side of the bridge. I went to check it out, and there he was, just a pup, thin as a rail, with a rope tied around his neck, abandoned. I felt a pang of sadness in my chest, imagining Max as a scared, lonely puppy. That's awful, I whispered, my heart aching for the dog. Tom nodded, his expression somber. It was, he agreed. But you know, as soon as I looked into those big brown eyes of his, I knew we were meant to stick together. We helped each other survive, day by day. I gave him what little food I had, and he gave me, well, he gave me a reason to keep going. He reached down and scratched Max behind the ears, and the dog leaned into his touch, eyes half closed in contentment. We've been a team ever since, Tom said, his voice filled with quiet pride. He's the best friend I've ever had. I smiled, feeling the warmth spread through me at the thought of their bond. It was exactly what I had been longing for, a connection, a friendship, something real and true. And in that moment I realized that this ritual, this simple act of bringing an apple each day, had brought me closer to that feeling than I'd ever been before. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the park, I knew it was time to go. But I wasn't leaving with the same sense of loneliness I used to feel. Now, there was something different, a small but growing sense of belonging, of being part of something, even if it was just this quiet, shared moment with Tom and Max. Same time tomorrow, I asked as I stood up, slinging my backpack over my shoulder. Tom looked up at me, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Wouldn't miss it, Liam, he said, tipping his cap. You take care now. You too, Tom. Bye, Max, I said, giving the dog one last pat before I turned to leave. As I walked away, the sound of their voices, Tom's low hum and Max's contented snuffling, followed me down the path, and I knew that this was more than just a ritual. It was a friendship, one that was growing with each passing day, nourished by small acts of kindness and shared moments of understanding. It was a gray, overcast afternoon, the kind where the sky feels heavy with the promise of rain. I hurried down the familiar path to the park, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. As I approached the bench, I could see Tom and Max in their usual spot, but something was different today. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, was standing near the bench, talking to Tom. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should approach. I had never seen anyone else talking to Tom before, and the sight of someone new made me feel strangely nervous. But then I saw Max glance up at me, his tail wagging slightly, and I knew I couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, I continued toward the bench, the apple in my hand feeling oddly heavy. As I got closer, the woman looked up and noticed me. She had kind eyes, the same color as the stormy sky above, and she smiled at me in a way that made me feel a little more at ease. "Hi there," she greeted me warmly, stepping aside to give me room. "You must be Liam." I blinked in surprise. Yeah, I'm Liam," I replied, glancing at Tom for some sort of explanation. Tom chuckled softly, the sound carrying a hint of amusement. "Liam, this is Emily," he said, nodding toward the woman. "She's an old friend of mine. We go way back." "Nice to meet you, Liam," Emily said, extending her hand. "Tom's told me a lot about you." I shook her hand, still feeling a bit unsure. "Nice to meet you too," I mumbled, my eyes flicking back to Tom. "Tom talks about me." "All good things, I promise," she assured me, her smile widening. "He says you've been a great help to him and Max here." Tom nodded in agreement. "That's right. Liam's got a good heart," he said, giving me a look that made me feel proud and a little embarrassed all at once. I handed Tom the apple, and he took it with a grateful nod. "Thanks, Liam," he said, as he always did, but today there was something different in his tone, something that made me feel like this small act meant more than I could ever know. "So, how do you two know each other?" I asked, trying to shake off the awkwardness I was feeling and genuinely curious about their connection. Emily glanced at Tom, her expression softening. "We met a long time ago, back when Tom was still working. He was a friend of my dad's," she explained, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "After my dad passed away, Tom looked out for me. He's always been like a second father to me." Tom smiled at her, his eyes filled with a deep affection that I hadn't seen before. "Emily here is like family to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She's always checking up on me, making sure I'm doing all right." Emily looked down at Max, who was now resting his head on her foot. "And I always make sure Max is doing all right too," she added with a laugh, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Isn't that right, Max?" Max thumped his tail in response, and I couldn't help but smile at the way he seemed to love the attention. "Emily's been trying to convince me to come stay with her for a while," Tom said, his tone a mix of gratitude and stubbornness. "But I keep telling her I'm fine right where I am." Emily sighed, her smile fading slightly. "I just worry about you, Tom," she said softly, "especially with the weather getting colder." Tom waved a hand dismissively. "I've made it through worse winters," he said, though I could hear the weariness in his voice. I shifted uncomfortably, feeling a pang of concern. The thought of Tom and Max out here in the cold, with no real shelter, made my chest tighten. "Maybe you should go with her, Tom," I suggested quietly, surprising myself with the boldness of my words. "Just until it gets warmer." Tom looked at me, his expression softening. "That's kind of you to say, Liam," he said. "But I've got my routine, my place here. It's not much, but it's home." Emily glanced between us, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "How about this?" she offered, her voice gentle. "You don't have to decide right now, Tom. Just think about it, okay? Max and I would love to have you stay for a while, even if it's just for a few days." Tom didn't respond right away, instead focusing on slicing the apple. I could tell he was thinking it over, but I also knew how stubborn he could be. The idea of leaving his spot, even temporarily, was probably hard for him to accept. "All right, Emily," he finally said, his voice resigned but not unkind. "I'll think about it." Emily smiled, relief evident in her expression. "That's all I ask," she said softly. She looked at me then, her eyes full of warmth. "And thank you, Liam, for being such a good friend to Tom and Max. It means a lot to know they have someone like you looking out for them. I felt my cheeks heat up at her praise, but I managed a small smile in return. It's nothing, really, I mumbled, feeling a bit embarrassed by the attention. I just want to help. And you are, she assured me. More than you know. We spent a few more minutes talking, the conversation light and easy, with Emily sharing stories about her life and her work. She told me about the time Tom had fixed her bike when she was a little girl and how she used to bring Max treats when he was just a puppy. Listening to her, I could see how much she cared about them both, and it made me feel better to know that they had someone like her in their lives. Eventually, Emily had to leave, and I watched as she hugged Tom tightly, promising to check in on him again soon. As she walked away, Max trotted after her for a few steps before returning to Tom's side, his tail wagging happily. "She's a good one, that Emily," Tom said, watching her go with a fond smile. "Yeah, she seems really nice," I agreed, still feeling the warmth of her kindness. Tom looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "You remind me a bit of her, you know," he said quietly. "Kind-hearted, always thinking of others." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions: pride, gratitude, and a little bit of sadness for reasons I couldn't quite explain. We sat there in silence for a while, the clouds overhead growing darker as the first drops of rain began to fall. I knew I should probably head home before the storm hit, but I didn't want to leave just yet. There was something comforting about being here, with Tom and Max, even in the rain. "Guess I should get going," I said reluctantly, standing up and pulling my hood over my head. "Take care, Liam," Tom said, giving me a nod. "And don't worry about us. We'll be all right." I nodded, though the worry still lingered in my chest. "See you tomorrow, Tom." "Bye, Max." As I walked away, I glanced back once more, watching as Tom and Max settled back onto the bench, the rain beginning to fall more steadily around them. I knew Tom was right. They would be all right. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing, that our little ritual might not last forever. And as I made my way home, the sound of rain tapping against my hood, I found myself hoping that Tom would take Emily up on her offer, if only to know that he and Max would be safe and warm for a little while. The morning dawned with a dismal gray sky, and the steady drizzle made the city streets slick and treacherous. I had woken up with a sinking feeling in my stomach, a sense that today might not go as smoothly as usual. Even so, I resolved to continue my little ritual, if for no other reason than it was the one thing I could rely on for solace and purpose. After school, I trudged through the wet streets toward the park, my rain jacket clinging to my shoulders. The park looked different today, almost unwelcoming. The trees, usually full of vibrant leaves, were bare and wet, their branches drooping under the weight of the rain. I squinted through the mist, looking for the familiar bench where Tom and Max often waited. When I finally arrived, I felt a knot of worry tighten in my chest. The bench was empty, and there was no sign of Tom or Max anywhere. The park seemed unusually deserted, and I felt a pang of disappointment mixed with a creeping anxiety. "Maybe they're just running late," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. I placed the apple on the bench as usual, hoping it would be a small token of my care that they would find later. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, Liam." I spun around to see Emily hurrying toward me, her face flushed from the cold. She looked concerned, and I could see that she was carrying an umbrella. "Emily," I called out, my relief evident. "I didn't see Tom or Max today. I was just about to leave." Emily's eyes widened in alarm. "Oh no, I was just on my way to check on them," she said, her voice laced with worry. "Tom didn't answer his phone this morning, and I've been trying to find him all day." My heart sank. "Do you think something's wrong?" I asked, feeling a wave of anxiety. Emily looked thoughtful, then nodded. "I hope not. But this weather makes it really hard to be outside. Let's check the usual spots and see if we can find them." We set off together, Emily holding the umbrella over both of us. We walked through the park, calling out Tom's name and looking under the shelter of the trees. I could feel the rain seeping through my shoes, but I barely noticed. My mind was focused on finding Tom and Max. As we walked, Emily spoke in a comforting tone. Tom and Max are tough, but this weather can be really harsh. They might have found shelter somewhere, though. I nodded, but my worry didn't ease. I hope they're okay, I said quietly. After a thorough search of the park and its surroundings, we were about to give up when Emily's phone rang. She answered it quickly, her voice a mix of relief and concern as she spoke. I could only hear snippets of the conversation, but it was enough to understand that Tom had been found. "It's Tom," Emily said, hanging up the phone. "He's at the nearby community center. He went there to stay out of the rain." "Thank goodness," I exclaimed, feeling a rush of relief. Emily and I hurried to the community center, the rain pouring down more heavily now. As we approached the building, I could see Tom sitting inside, his usual hat and coat still damp from the rain. Max was curled up beside him on a blanket, looking sleepy but content. "Tom," Emily called out as we entered, her voice echoing in the large warm room. Tom looked up, his face brightening as he saw us. "Emily." "And Liam. I didn't expect to see you here." Emily rushed over and gave Tom a hug, careful not to disturb Max. "I was worried about you. I'm glad you're safe and warm." Tom grinned, though he looked a bit embarrassed. "I'm fine, really. Just got caught in the rain and figured this place would be a good spot to wait it out." I walked over to Tom and Max, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. "I'm glad you're okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I was really worried. Tom patted the seat next to him, motioning for me to sit down. "You and Emily came through just in time," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I was about to head back out, but this place is a real lifesaver." Emily took a seat on the other side of Tom, her eyes still filled with concern but softened by relief. "Next time, we'll make sure to keep better track of you," she said gently. "And maybe I'll convince you to come stay with me for a bit, if this weather keeps up." Tom chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're always looking out for me, Emily. I appreciate it. Really. And I'll think about your offer." I watched as Emily and Tom talked, feeling a sense of calm return. Max nuzzled against me, his wet fur warm and comforting. I reached out to scratch behind his ears, and he responded with a happy wag of his tail. "I'm glad everything turned out okay," I said, looking up at Emily. "And thanks for coming to find them. It means a lot." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You're welcome, Liam. We're all in this together, right?" I nodded, feeling a newfound sense of connection and reassurance. "Yeah, together," I agreed. As the rain continued to pour outside, we spent the rest of the afternoon at the community center, talking and sharing stories. The warmth of the building and the kindness of Emily and Tom made me forget about the dreary weather outside. For a few hours, it felt like everything was right in the world. When the rain finally began to let up, I knew it was time to head home. Emily offered to give me a ride, and I gladly accepted. As we walked out of the community center, I looked back at Tom and Max, feeling a sense of relief and hope. "See you tomorrow, Tom," I said, waving as we left. "Stay safe." "I will, Liam. Thanks for everything," Tom replied, his voice filled with warmth. Emily and I drove home, the rain now a gentle drizzle. I looked out the window, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the small acts of kindness that had brought us all together. Even though the day had started off with uncertainty, it ended with a renewed sense of connection and hope. And as I headed to bed that night, I realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, like a simple apple left on a bench, could lead to the most meaningful moments of all. The days following the rainstorm had brought a welcome change to the weather. The skies cleared, leaving behind a crisp, refreshing air that made the park feel alive again. The sun shone brightly, casting dappled light through the leaves of the trees. I was eager to return to my usual routine, but something felt different today, as if a new chapter was about to unfold. After school, I made my way to the park, carrying a freshly polished apple in my backpack. My ritual of leaving the apple on the bench had become a source of comfort and anticipation. As I approached, I noticed that the park was bustling with people enjoying the clear weather. Children played on the swings, and joggers pounded the paths, their footsteps rhythmic against the ground. When I reached the bench, I was surprised to see a young boy sitting there, his small frame hunched over a book. He appeared to be around my age, with tousled brown hair and a thoughtful expression. Beside him lay a small, scruffy dog that looked up at me with curious eyes. "Hello," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Is this your bench?" The boy looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of surprise and shyness. "Oh, hi. No, I don't think so. I'm just reading here. My name's Daniel." "I'm Liam," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. "I usually leave an apple here for Tom and his dog, Max. They weren't here last time because of the rain." Daniel's face lit up with interest. "Tom and Max. I've seen them around. They're really nice. Do you come here often?" "Yeah, almost every day," I said, feeling a little more comfortable. "I like bringing them apples. It's kind of my thing." Daniel nodded, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "That's really nice of you. I've always wanted to do something like that, but I didn't know where to start." I hesitated for a moment before pulling out the apple from my backpack. "Well, you could join me today. I can show you where Tom and Max usually sit." Daniel's face brightened. "Really? That would be awesome. I'd love to help." As we walked together through the park, I noticed that Daniel had a kind and genuine demeanor. He told me about his own love for books and nature, which resonated with me. It was refreshing to meet someone who shared similar interests. "So, what kind of books do you like?" I asked, hoping to learn more about my new companion. Daniel's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I love adventure stories and fantasy. Right now, I'm reading about a boy who discovers a hidden world in his backyard. It's really exciting." "That sounds amazing," I said, smiling. "I like adventure books too. There's something special about escaping into a different world, don't you think?" Daniel nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. And being out in nature feels like an adventure too. There's so much to explore and discover." As we neared the bench, I spotted Tom and Max walking towards us, their familiar figures becoming visible through the trees. My heart lifted with joy at the sight of them. "Hey, Tom. Max," I called out, waving excitedly. Tom looked up and smiled warmly. "Liam, it's good to see you. And who's your friend?" "This is Daniel," I introduced, feeling a bit shy. "He's going to join us today." Tom extended his hand in greeting. "Nice to meet you, Daniel. It's always good to meet someone who cares about the little things." Daniel shook Tom's hand, his eyes full of admiration. "It's nice to meet you too, Tom. Liam told me all about your apples. I think it's a really great idea." Tom's face softened with appreciation. "Thank you, Daniel. It's people like you and Liam who make the world a better place." Max wagged his tail and trotted over to sniff Daniel, his friendly demeanor making the introduction even warmer. Daniel laughed and petted Max gently. "Wow, Max is really sweet," Daniel said, his voice full of affection. Tom chuckled. "He's a good companion, always there when I need him." We settled on the bench, and I handed the apple to Tom, who accepted it with a grateful nod. Max sniffed the apple and then looked up at us with eager eyes. "Thank you, Liam," Tom said, taking a bite of the apple. "It's always nice to have a treat." As we sat and talked, I found myself feeling more at ease with Daniel around. His enthusiasm and genuine nature made it easy to connect with him. We exchanged stories and shared our favorite books, finding common ground in our love for adventure and the outdoors. By the time the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, I realized that this simple act of kindness had led to something truly special. I had made a new friend, and it felt like the beginning of a new chapter in my life. "Well, I should get going," Daniel said, looking at his watch. "But I had a great time today. Thanks for letting me join you." "I had a great time too," I replied, feeling a sense of warmth and satisfaction. "I'm glad we met, Daniel." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining with genuine happiness. "Me too. Maybe we can do this again sometime." "Definitely," I said, feeling a sense of excitement. "I'd like that." As Daniel waved goodbye and walked away with his dog, I watched him disappear into the distance, feeling a renewed sense of hope and connection. The park, once a place of solitude, had become a space of friendship and shared joy. When Tom and Max finally headed home, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The simple ritual of leaving an apple on a bench had led to a meaningful connection with someone who shared my interests and values. It was a reminder that even the smallest gestures of kindness could lead to profound and lasting friendships. And as I walked back home, I realized that today had been a turning point. The park, once a place of solitude, now held the promise of new beginnings and lasting connections. The days grew warmer as summer approached, and the park became even more vibrant with flowers in full bloom and people enjoying the sunshine. My routine of leaving an apple on the bench for Tom and Max had become an integral part of my days, and my new friendship with Daniel had only made these visits more meaningful. One particularly sunny afternoon, as I was on my way to the park, I spotted Daniel walking ahead of me, his dog trotting alongside him. I quickened my pace to catch up with him, feeling a familiar surge of excitement at the thought of sharing another day at the park. "Hey, Daniel," I called out, waving. Daniel turned and smiled, his eyes lighting up. "Liam, hi, I was just heading to the park too. Fancy a walk together?" "Sure," I replied, falling into step beside him. I brought an apple for Tom and Max. "Do you want to join me?" "Absolutely," Daniel said enthusiastically. "I brought some snacks too. Thought it might be nice to share." We reached the park and approached our usual bench, where Tom and Max were already waiting. Tom's face brightened when he saw us, and he waved in greeting. "Liam, Daniel, good to see you both," Tom said, standing up to greet us. "It's always a pleasure to see you too." "Hi, Tom. I brought an apple," I said, handing him the fruit with a smile. "And Daniel brought some snacks for us to share." Tom's eyes twinkled with appreciation. "Thank you, Liam and Daniel. That's very kind of you." As we all settled on the bench, Daniel unpacked his snacks, revealing a variety of treats, including sandwiches and fruit. Max sniffed the offerings eagerly, his tail wagging in anticipation. "Wow, this looks great," Tom said, eyeing the spread. "It's always nice to have a little picnic in the park." We chatted as we shared the snacks, discussing our favorite books and adventures. The conversation flowed easily, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. The park, once a place of solitude, had become a space of warmth and connection. "You know," Daniel said, breaking into the conversation, "I've been thinking about how amazing it is that such a simple act, like leaving an apple on a bench, can lead to so much good. It's like a ripple effect." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "It's true. Kindness has a way of spreading beyond what we can see. Your small act of leaving an apple has not only made my day, but also brought us all together." "I never really thought of it that way," I admitted, feeling a sense of pride in what we had created. It just felt right to do something nice. I guess I didn't realize how far-reaching the impact could be. Tom smiled warmly. "Sometimes the simplest gestures can have the most profound effects. It's not just about the apple or the snacks. It's about the connection it fosters and the joy it brings." As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the park, a family approached the bench. The parents, a couple in their early 30s, walked with their young daughter, who was holding a colorful drawing. "Excuse me," the father said, approaching Tom. "We saw you sharing snacks and having a good time. We wanted to thank you for making this park such a welcoming place. My daughter, Emily, wanted to give you this." Emily shyly handed Tom her drawing, which depicted a sunny park scene with smiling figures. Tom accepted it with a surprised and grateful smile. "Thank you, Emily," Tom said, his voice filled with emotion. "This is a beautiful drawing. It means a lot to us." Emily beamed, her parents smiling proudly. "We come to the park often, and we've seen you here. It's nice to see people enjoying themselves and being kind." As the family walked away, Tom's eyes were misty with gratitude. "You see, Liam and Daniel, it's not just us making an impact. We're all part of a bigger picture, and kindness connects us in ways we might not always see." Daniel and I exchanged glances, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The park had become more than just a place to visit. It was a space where kindness thrived and connections were made. "I guess we really did start something special," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's incredible to think about how our little acts of kindness have created such a positive ripple." "I think we're just getting started," I replied, feeling a surge of optimism. "There's so much more we can do." As the sun set and the park began to empty, Tom, Daniel, and I lingered, savoring the final moments of our time together. The simple ritual of leaving an apple on the bench had grown into something much larger, a celebration of kindness, friendship, and the profound impact of small, compassionate gestures. Walking home that evening, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The park, once a symbol of solitude, had become a testament to the power of kindness and the joy of meaningful connections. And as I looked forward to the days ahead, I knew that our journey was just beginning, filled with endless possibilities and the promise of more heartwarming moments to come.